Open your ears and crack some beers. You are listening to episode 20 of Retro Hangover.
And hello, Internet. I am actively avoiding alliteration for this episode. But that's because we are back.
We are back.
After so long. Welcome to Retro Hangover, episode, 20?
Yeah, man. 20.
I don't even think it matters the amount of episode numbers we're on again. Just because it's been such a layover or a hangover from the last time we did a recording. In any case, I am your co-host, Chris Copleen, and I am joined today by primary host, the Super Shane Koski. How are you doing, Shane?
Doing pretty good. Pretty good. I'm glad to be back recording. It has been quite some time. And for the record, I still think that the episode numbers matter. 20 it's a nice even number. It suggests that we've been doing this for at least some time, you know?
I mean, we did start doing this like 3 years ago.
Yeah, let's not talk about that.
It's a relatively old podcast.
It is, surprisingly, but
there's a legacy.
Yeah, but no, man, I'm doing pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. As happy as I can be to be back in the U.S. of A. after being away again for another year with no internet or civilization or cell phones, which has its pluses and its negatives, obviously, but I can't really complain. It's nice to be back. How about you?
Yeah, well, I'm glad to have you back, and at least this time you'll be sticking around for, a relatively significant amount of time. So here's hoping that we can kind of keep this thing a little bit more regular than we had been in the past, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. I want to. Hopefully it gets back to what we were doing when we first started the show. Like, it was weekly for a few months, and then we went bi-weekly, and then, life happened, to put it delicately, I guess. Not in a negative way.
As it does. But yeah, I think I'm probably going to throw a quick little blog post about this, too, up on the site for anybody who, actually goes and looks at that. But just in quick summation, I guess the idea is that at least initially we want to do this, I think, bi-weekly to start with, just with the way our schedules are, or at least I know mine is pretty crazy, so trying to fit it in is going to be difficult, but I definitely want to do it. Yeah, I mean, and the other piece is that actually it is kind of important that we're sort of completely restructuring the format. So the idea being that this will be a lot more concise. Should be about half hour, hopefully no more than about 45 minutes, but we're really shooting for that half hour mark. And then outside of that, we want to kind of tackle more of just actual like retro topics, because we feel like it kind of fits our name and sort of our theme a lot more. So each individual episode will just be kind of touching on one piece of gaming history, whether it's a console or a game or game series, or perhaps just a famous individual in the gaming industry. But yeah, man, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, much more focused, provide that aspect. Hopefully we can deliver better or as well as than other podcasts can, but we'll put our best foot forward, and hopefully we'll get an audience. We love you if you're listening to us right now, by the way. So I say we get to business and we get to brass tacks and start doing what we do.
All right, let's do it, man. All right, so we're starting off with the original PlayStation. I feel like I have this tendency to want to call it the PS1, but I know that's actually like technically erroneous, so I won't do that. But it's the original PlayStation, and we're going to go over a little bit of the history of the console. And then the idea is we want to talk about what were our favorite games from that run and why, and whether or not we think that system still holds up today, just as is. Is it something that someone could pick up today and still enjoy? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and he's gonna learn you on some history.
That's right. Today I'm here to talk to you about the PS1 or PSX or PlayStation, whatever you want to call it. It's been called many things over the years. So many of our audience probably already knows this story. It's been published over the years. It's no surprise to anybody anymore, but the PlayStation idea or concept started off as the Super Nintendo, SNES, SNES. I don't want to call it SNES anyway. I'm diverging here. It's a CD add-on for that system. The actual hybrid system, which combined the Super Nintendo Famicom with the CD add-on, was called the PlayStation. So this all started back when Ken Kutaragi started by developing the audio chip for the original Super Nintendo, which is called the SPC 700. Due to the success that the sound chip had, Sony and Nintendo started to do the CD project together back in 1988. Of course, you have to remember 1988 was when they were starting to transition out of the Famicom to the Super Famicom in Japan, but we can talk about that at another time. Due to the media used, the Super CD, or whatever it was called, whatever Sony was developing for the system, and contract agreements that they agreed upon between Nintendo and Sony, Sony was going to make a lot more money than Nintendo wanted them to. That's essentially what happened. So Hiroshi Yamauchi, who shares many similarities with a mushroom from Mario Kart, started negotiating with Philips to make the add-on itself. In 1991, Nintendo decided they were going to go to the Consumer Electronics Show and announce this partnership with Philips. A day after, Sony decided they were going to announce that they were making the Nintendo or Sony PlayStation. So you could imagine how awkward it was to be Sony at the time. So, needless to say, there was a bit of a dispute and tensions and disagreements between Nintendo and Sony. They tried to make it work for, I guess, a year, trying to get back to the contract negotiations, how the media format would benefit both people, how Nintendo would get the licensing agreements. But ultimately, it fell flat in 1992, and Sony decided they were going to make their own system, which eventually led to the creation of the CDI Zelda trilogy, Hotel Mario, and, of course, the Sony PlayStation. Its original launch in Japan was December 3rd, 1994. It launched in the United States on September 9th, 1995. Incidentally, 4 years exactly to the date with the Sega Dreamcast. And in Europe on the 29th of September in 1995. It was officially discontinued on March 23rd, 2006. Almost 12 years after its launch. It sold 102.5 million units. Which is the fourth best-selling video game console of all time, behind the Game Boy Color line, the Nintendo DS, and its ultimate successor, the PlayStation 2. The best-selling games on the PlayStation were Gran Turismo, with a little over 10 million units sold, Final Fantasy VII, with 9.8 million units sold, Gran Turismo 2, with 9.3 million units sold, Tekken 3, with 8.3 million units sold, and coming in at number 5 is everyone's favorite, the notable classic Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone at 8 million units. So this is all real. So there's your brief history. A little extra notes. If you look at the history of the PlayStation, you can kind of see what happened after the fallout with Nintendo, with development that you see on the Sega CD, with a lot of Sony-sponsored projects, games like Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I have and is complete and utter shit. So
nothing like the movie. The movie's a classic.
Nothing like the movie. Of course, it was the most successful console out of the three. As you see, it was the fourth best-selling console of all time, easily defeating the Sega Saturn, the Nintendo 64, and also lesser-known systems like the Atari Jaguar and the Panasonic 3DO. Those are stories, of course, for another time that we will hopefully get to talk about. But for today's sake, that is the history of the Sony PlayStation, whose legacy continues on to this day with emulation in the PS2 and PS3. Shane?
Yeah, I got to be honest with you. I was surprised by the bestseller list. Not the entire list, actually, just the fifth one, really.
Oh, absolutely. I saw that too. 8 million units for Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
With the number of quality titles that ended up coming out for the PlayStation, I'm surprised that made it to the top 5. I'm also actually kind of surprised that FF7 wasn't number 1, but I suppose Gran Turismo had a lot more broad appeal, I suppose.
To be fair, Gran Turismo was packed in with some versions of the PlayStation as well.
Ah, that's how they get you. All right, so they cheated. Yeah. All right, I'm counting FF7 as the number 1 then.
Right, it's kind of like how Super Mario Brothers sold 40 million units.
Right.
So, because it was packaged in every Nintendo. That's not the same for Gran Turismo. They've had a lot of bundles, and a lot of bundles didn't have games. And if we ever talk about the fifth generation console wars, we can talk about Saturn and PlayStation and how that was actually pretty contentious. But we'll get to that someday, and that day is not today.
Yeah, the other piece of this like brief history that kind of caught my attention was the end of the deal, I suppose. So in 1992, I guess the only positive thing I think that came out of that was the PlayStation itself, because that list of other things like, you know, the CDI Zelda games, for instance, or Hotel Mario, maybe not the best. I mean, they're good for some like ironic entertainment in the same way that you watch a movie for it being so hilariously awful that it's entertaining.
I think the CDI itself would fit in that category of being so hilariously awful as entertaining.
That's a good point. Yeah. All right. So having said all that, we want to talk about what our favorite games from that console were. Now, just some quick kind of backstory on this one. As you might have guessed, Chris has a lot more experience with the PlayStation than I did. I was a Nintendo 64 kid growing up, so my experience with the PlayStation was relegated mostly to renting it from the local movie gallery. However, having said that, I don't know how you felt about yours, but I actually had a really hard toss-up. And I'm still not 100% settled, if I'm being perfectly frank, but
okay.
My top two that I was kind of going back and forth on are Symphony of the Night and the original Silent Hill.
Good choices.
So they both definitely have their pros and cons in my own personal opinion, and they both speak to me in very, very different ways. But I think ultimately Silent Hill is going to win out for me. And that's just because, though I am a huge fan of the sort of Metroidvania style Castlevania games, and Symphony of the Night was basically the granddaddy of that style and informed the design decisions for most, if not all, of the 2D Castlevania games following it. Silent Hill just kind of holds like a special place in my heart, if for nothing else than it being the thing that brought us Silent Hill 2, which if we ever do a PS2 episode, which I imagine at some point we will, that spoiler alert, that's probably going to be my favorite. But
it is the best survival horror game probably ever.
True, yeah. And so in making this decision, I was kind of poking around a little bit, and just some kind of interesting facts that went into the creation of Silent Hill, since we are kind of talking about the history of certain things. If you didn't know, Silent Hill was developed by Team Silent at Konami, and this team was actually put together by a bunch of folks that ended up really feeling mostly like outcasts from the rest of the company, largely in the way that they were treated by everyone else at Konami, and the fact that the project they were working on was far outside of the wheelhouse of what the rest of Konami's development teams were actually doing.
Wait, are you telling me Konami would alienate their employees?
I know it's surprising, but I'm here to tell you that was the case.
I have never heard anything like that ever before coming about Konami. They are such an innocent company and everyone loves them.
Well, I have this gentleman you might want to look into. His name's Jim Sterling, and he has some opinions about Konami.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Hideo Kojima.
Well, yeah. But the interesting thing, and actually I think it was to the consumer's benefit, was given that they were sort of the pariahs of the company, they were sort of left to their own devices. So they were given a lot of creative freedom, which was largely unusual at the time. And that really helped to get them to where they wanted to go. They were able to take a more artistic approach to the game, which is what they actually wanted to do. And the director of the game, Keiichiro Toyama, had basically no experience with horror movies up until that point. But he was very, very interested in the concept of UFOs, which may have informed the surprise secret ending of the game. The occult, and perhaps most importantly, David Lynch films. This also might explain why I ended up really liking the game so much, because I'm a Lynch fan myself.
No idea who that is.
He is responsible for things like Twin Peaks and Eraserhead. Basically just crazy psychological thriller type movies. They're largely incomprehensible, at least on first viewing. They're very dense and very disturbing.
I might have to look that up. I've never seen Twin Peaks, but I've seen a lot about it.
Yeah, I would. You should just totally go for watch Eraserhead, and that'll give you. Also, just as a quick aside, if you've never seen Jacob's Ladder, that is a huge inspiration to what went into the Silent Hill games going forward.
You mean like piercings?
Not that kind of Jacob's Ladder, no. The film, but no, if you look at some of the sort of creature design and the special effects that went into that movie, they are direct inspirations to things that you end up seeing in like Silent Hill 2, for instance. So little interesting thing to look into.
Okay.
Cool thing was this was actually Toyama's first role as a director, so he kind of knocked that one out of the park. The last little bit that was interesting to me anyway was the soundtrack. So that was recorded by Akira Yamaoka, who, if I'm not mistaken, went on to do the soundtracks for at least Silent Hill 2 and 3 as well. And his style is very, very specific and very identifiable. So he decided to go with an industrial style to kind of evoke a cold, rusty feeling, which I think he definitely hit directly on the head. Which, when he presented it to Konami executives originally, they thought it was actually a sound bug because they had no idea the sort of feel that he was going for, and so they thought it was just a bunch of random noise. So he had to very carefully explain it to them, but he did an amazing job. I actually still occasionally listen to the Silent Hill soundtracks, like on Spotify, just because they're so atmospheric. Also, really good for Halloween music, by the way.
Very atmospheric, very, very atmospheric soundtrack that lends a lot to the game, which, before I let you continue, is why I thought Silent Hill was such a better survival horror game than Resident Evil. I mean, that game, even with the graphics the way they are, looking back at it, is still a creepy-ass game. Hasn't aged well, but it's still far creepier than what Resident Evil was doing at the time. And we saw how those paths diverged and how Silent Hill stayed true to it and Resident Evil kind of didn't. But Silent Hill, in my opinion anyway, a much better survival horror game than Resident Evil.
Oh no, I agree. And the last quick little piece there, I think this is pretty common knowledge at this point, but it was sort of a fortunate side effect, I suppose, of the limitations of the hardware at the time. But that's the reason that there was so much fog and darkness in the game, really, outside of being atmospheric, was just that the PlayStation couldn't render much more outside of that sort of view circle. So kind of good on Team Silent for, getting creative with their solution to that problem, and it ended up being a hallmark of the series. So, but that's all I had to say on that one. So Silent Hill, I think my number one from the PlayStation. So what about you, Chris? What's your top pick?
First of all, you kind of caught me off guard, and I really have to step my game up because you went really deep. Like, these are the kind of things I back in the day used to think about. But I'm happy you picked Silent Hill because the game that has stuck with me on the original PlayStation after all these years is Castlevania Symphony of the Night. That is my favorite game on the original PlayStation. I wouldn't put Silent Hill in my top two. I do love Silent Hill. I think it's a great game. I played it probably about 2 years ago just to jog my memory again, and it's a fantastic game. And it's a hard choice to say Castlevania as well because there are so many good games on the PlayStation. I just have to mention, like Final Fantasy Tactics, the Suikoden series, particularly Suikoden 2. Final Fantasy 9 is really good. Final Fantasy 7 is a good game. However, don't feel the same way about it as a lot of other people do. Not saying it's bad, but it's not the same game that a lot of other people say. Metal Gear Solid is amazing. It's a fantastic, fantastic cinematic game that has its flaws, but it's still a great game. There's so many. I can go on and on. Gran Turismo, probably my favorite racing series of all time. But I would have to stick with Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It's one of the few games that I feel like out of that list I can go back to today and play it the same way I played it back in what was like 1997, 1998 when it came out, and still play it the same way and still not be and not be turned away from the graphics, not be turned away from the gameplay. It's arguably perfectly balanced, maybe a tad bit on the easy side, especially for the lineage of Castlevania, what had been up to that point, considering that it had a notoriety of being a difficult series, even with one of the easier games, Super Castlevania 4, being a relatively difficult game for a platformer. But the difficulty was inviting. It borrowed a lot from the positive aspects of Metroid and Super Metroid, and got rid of a lot of the irritating things from that series, I think, where, you know, they just kind of hide things in areas you would never look for, and more in Castlevania, looking for things and finding things is more natural. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take as much of a creative link or thinking leap to figure out how to advance next. And the fact that, and a lot of people have said this, so I'm not saying anything original here, the fact that back then you didn't know there was a entire second part of the game, and you had to do specific things. But if you paid attention to the game and the gameplay and what was going on with it, you could figure it out easily enough and get the true ending and play the entire game, which was generally not really done back in the day, back in that time period, not those kind of twists and turns. And it really opened up an entire series to me, because I had not really paid attention to the Castlevania series as a whole up till then, and the lineage and the lore, and I loved it. Like, even if you look at my email today, it has Alucard in it. So
he's not lying. It does.
Yes. So definitely it's one of my favorite games of all time. I don't know, it's not my favorite game of all time, but it's definitely my favorite game on the PlayStation. So many different ways to play it nowadays too. I wouldn't say going back and playing it on the original PlayStation is the best way to do it. Certainly it's better than playing the Saturn version, but
I feel like that can be said in a lot of cases.
Yeah, 2D games, this was an exception. It's very, very alienating on the Saturn if you had played the PlayStation version. And a lot of 2D games on the PlayStation, if they had a Saturn port, were significantly better on the Sega Saturn. Significantly is probably too strong of a word, but they were better to the point where it was noticeable.
Was that just because the Saturn had better hardware?
For 2D games, yes. Particularly when you look at games with the 4 megabyte RAM expansion port for like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel vs. Street Fighter, the SNK King of Fighters games, stuff like that. 2D games were just better. Mm-hmm. Had more frames, animation, loaded faster, more transparency effects that were better. But once you got into 3D realm, yeah, PlayStation just absolutely crushed it. There wasn't even a question. It was obvious that in terms of 3D power, the PlayStation was significantly better than the Saturn. But yeah, that's all I really have to say about Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It's if you haven't played it by now, what are you doing? It's a true classic, and Bloodstained is coming out soon, so you can get your Castlevania back on. Even though it's not Castlevania, but Koji Igarashi is remaking the game, and I believe Castlevania Symphony of the Night, I don't want to say it was his first Castlevania game, but it was definitely his first Castlevania game of note that completely redirected the idea of the entire series moving forward up until they ruined it with Lords of Shadow.
You know what? I'm going to be honest. This is a whole other topic for another day, but I actually kind of enjoyed Lords of Shadow. Not the second one. That one was kind of garbage, but the first one I actually kind of liked.
Okay, Lords of Shadow, is it a bad game? No. It's a very above average game. I would say it's a very above average game. It's enjoyable for what it is, but it's not Castlevania. Sorry.
I'll give you that. Yeah. I think on its own though, it was at least serviceable. But so so what you were saying about the comparison, well, the comparison between the Saturn and the PlayStation, but more to the point, people picking up some of this stuff today, that works as a good segue. So I'm gonna let you keep going on that one, Chris. So why don't you start off? How do you feel about the PlayStation today? Is this something that you think someone could pick up and play some of these titles and still enjoy themselves, or is it so outdated that you just are not going to be able to get over, some of the technical, limitations of the time?
I think it depends on your taste in gaming. if you're more into 2D platformers and you know what to look for, the Sony PlayStation can still deliver a lot of those experiences, and for a relatively inexpensive price. If you want, I mean, do not get a Sony PlayStation 1. Don't get it. There's no point unless you get the PS1, the actual PS1 with the LCD screen attachment.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be my recommendation, just because, one, it's a novelty. The resolution on that screen is crisp. It's a first party screen. If you can score it, it's gone up way in price. I remember it was like $50 3 years ago. Now it's like 100 and something. But if you want to play PS1 games, do it on a PS3, because you can do it with HDMI out. PS3s are relatively easy to come by. Even the large ones that I have, where that can play PS1, PS2, and PS3 games. If you have the money, it's only, I mean, if you're going to get a new console, you're going to invest in it, they're still $100. But if you're going to get a PS3, you're going to be paying that money anyway. So go ahead and get a PS3 to play it. You can also get probably a PS2 super duper cheap, thin or thick. Get out those, play PS2, PS1 games as well. You do need to buy a memory card on top of it. But in terms of the 3D games, a lot of those 3D games, do they hold up? It depends. If you grew up with the stuff, I would say sure, because you know what to expect. You know what's coming down the pipeline. You might have more of a case of nostalgia, since you did experience it, since you did play with it. Camera navigation is awful, because even after the DualShock came out in like late 1997, they didn't know how to utilize that right analog stick to save their damn lives. They were still using R and L as camera adjustments, and that was because I don't think they wanted to alienate their audience by splitting their base by making cameras on the right stick, because they still wanted to have so many games that could be played with the default controller for like early adapters, and I can understand that. But it really, like in terms of 3D games, you're not going to get as good of an experience as you would get a generation later, when they find like, oh, this is what the right analog stick is for. This is what we can do with it. Like R1 and L1 and R2 and L2 aren't for camera navigation. It's for this. So I would be a little hesitant. There are great 3D games like Metal Gear Solid. I would go there, because it's still you can kind of control it more like a 2D game. The original Resident Evil, I would say, works better with a D-pad. Same with Resident Evil 2. Then I think the analog stick, I might be alone in that opinion. But you just got, and they also don't have camera angles. They're all pre-rendered backgrounds, so you're not going to have to deal with moving the camera. The game is more for you. That's pretty much, it's all up to what you want to get out of it. If you're a true retro collector, you won't mind the graphics. If you've never gone back and played those games, it's going to be very difficult to stomach. It's like someone who grew up on Super Nintendo trying to go back to Atari. It's just hard. It's you really have to have a passion for those games.
Yeah, so I think you and I are in agreement on that one, by and large. They're not having any of the nostalgia for, the system or the vast majority of the titles in its library. I guess maybe had a little bit more of an objective viewpoint than perhaps some other folks who grew up with the PlayStation, but it is definitely very rough to go back to, for a number of reasons, most of which you've already kind of outlined. The ones that stick out for me are not even so much the graphics. I don't mind that. That actually is a bigger problem, in my opinion, on the N64, which is something that I'm sure we'll talk about in the near future. But the controls are a big hindrance in most cases, even with the dual analog, like you said, because they weren't developed to really take advantage of that second stick. It's really unintuitive to control some of those games. Like even my number one pick, Silent Hill, like I went back and I played it again on my slim PS2 that I've got a few months back, actually, and spent a better part of an afternoon kind of just blasting through at least half of that game, I think. And it takes a little bit of getting used to. So one of the things that luckily kind of went away in the generations following this one was the ever infamous tank controls, and that's something that you kind of touched on with Resident Evil. If that's not something that you are already used to, going in, you're going to have no idea how to properly control your character, and it's a pretty steep learning curve. Luckily, future versions of these games, like HD remasters and, you know, those collections and things like that, implemented more modern control schemes. So in my opinion, that makes a lot of those games much better. And I think on the whole, my suggestion for that, unless you really want the authentic PlayStation experience, which in some cases you might, but if that's not what you're going after and you're really just, you want to experience these games that you've heard people talk about so much, or I'd even make the argument that even if you played these games in your childhood, the remastered versions, for the most part, some of them totally fucked it up. Like, let's not even talk about the Silent Hill collection that they released, because that was hot garbage. But
you know why though?
Well, are you talking about the fact that they lost the original code base for the game?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was a big contributing factor, but there were also some other design decisions that went into those remasters that were completely insane. But that's a topic for maybe another time. But no, I think by and large, those HD remasters might be the best way, honestly, to go about playing those. As long as they didn't royally screw something up in that conversion process, those games are going to look the way that the image in your head of those games looks. As like a quick sort of anecdotal story for that, one of the biggest games of my childhood growing up was Ocarina of Time, and it looks far worse than the images in my head would lead me to believe. And luckily, playing the 3DS version of that looks like what I think the game always looked like. So
now a question about that, really quick, is do you think because the PlayStation 1 has so many options to upgrade the visuals on it, like through HDMI on the PS3 or through a component with the PS2, and you can download them from the PS3 and the PS Store, so you're going to have them up converted to 1080p, and that's easy to do with PS1 games, as opposed to games like on the Sega Saturn and the N64, where you do not have that option. Do you think that could be a leading contributor? Like, when I go back and I play PS1 games, they look almost how I remember them looking, but when I go back and look at a N64 game, it looks like hot trash.
Yeah, I mean that definitely helps for sure, and that might actually be enough, right? But I'm still gonna stick with, I feel like maybe in a subjective way, I think maybe the air quotes best way to play a lot of these titles is if they had a good remaster. I would probably stick with that, but in the end, you know, it doesn't hurt to at least go back and experience some of these games on the original system, or, you know, a system that will run the original versions of the game. I happen to like my slim PS2, so.
Now, really quickly, and this is something I've been trying to think about. I'm trying to think about my initial experiences with the PS1, because it wasn't my first system from that generation. It was my second system. Well, I mean, our family got them all at the same time because, you know, we were spoiled and rich and stuff like that. But I got the N64. My brother got the PlayStation. My sister got a Saturn. So I don't remember back in 1995 the launch of the PlayStation. I think I didn't. Me personally, I didn't think anything of it because I'd already seen the 3DO. It flopped. It was from a major company. It was from Panasonic. I saw the Jaguar. It flopped. I don't think I even had the PlayStation on my radar. I don't know if you did, but I remember the Super Nintendo, that launch was a big deal for me. Like, even the 32X's launch was a big deal for me, as much as that system sucked. Like, I remember that being a big, big deal. I don't remember any hype. Maybe it was because my age and it wasn't aimed towards my demographic, but I don't remember anything with the PlayStation during that time until my friend one day brought over Resident Evil to play on my brother's console, and I knew that Final Fantasy VII was coming out, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh look, this might be a good system. Even though when it launched and I saw like stuff like Battle Arena, Toshinden, and Jet Moto, and I told myself I don't want to play those games, and I'm probably smart for it, I had no idea about the system until about 1996, early 1997.
Yeah, I think I had a somewhat similar experience, but I think that was because I don't recall anybody that I knew having a PlayStation or really knowing anything about it. And my memory might not be serving me very well, but I know from like my experience, we were almost exclusively a Nintendo household for the majority of my childhood, with the exception of starting off with Sega Master System, which we will definitely talk about.
Yes.
But outside of that, I had an NES, and then the Super Nintendo was huge for me and for my brother. So we were psyched about that one. And then the N64, I remember getting that on Christmas actually, and my first game for it was Doom 64, which I actually hated, even though I love Doom. But that might have been a product of the time.
But isn't that weird though? Like, do you remember being hyped for the N64?
Oh yeah, like very, very much. But the PlayStation, like you, was basically not even on my radar. I think I actually came to it later than you did, because I didn't end up going and, like I said earlier, renting it from a movie store to play like over a weekend or whatever. I want to say probably not until 97 or 98.
I mean, that's when a lot of people would have gotten into it, because that's when, Final Fantasy VII got on the system. It was heavily advertised, and then a lot of people got into it. Same with Gran Turismo, and how that was advertised and brought people to it. I actually think that the game that broke the dam was Resident Evil. I don't think it gets nearly the amount of credit that it does. All the credit almost always goes to Final Fantasy VII and the defining PlayStation game, as well as it could be understood. But I think what brought a lot of people over was Resident Evil, just because when you look at the graphics, the maturity, the demographic, I think it picked up Sega's consumers, from how badly Sega had botched everything. Because I was a Sega Nintendo guy. I split. I love both systems. I had no idea the Saturn was any good. I thought it was crap. I was all like, every single time I went to the arcade, Killer Instinct coming on the Ultra 64, get me an N64. So I didn't think of, Sony or Sega, but when you say 1998, that completely and totally makes sense. Just because the amount of games that had been accumulating.
Yeah. So I guess, I don't know. I'd be curious if anybody out there, our listeners, if you exist, I'd be curious to hear from some other folks about their experiences with that, and whether or not, our childhood experience of kind of not even knowing this was a thing until, a little bit later in its life cycle, I guess, if that is common, or if maybe we were just like, I don't know, living in some sort of weird like Nintendo bubble for a while.
For reference, we are in our 30s.
Yes, that is true.
I think that needs to be said. Because if you're like 40 years old, you're probably going to have a much clearer idea of what the PlayStation was.
Yeah, you might have been like paying attention to the CES like the year that it was shown.
$299.
Yeah.
End up killing the Saturn. Quick, what was your first PlayStation game?
Oh man, my first PlayStation game. That is a good question. I'm racking my brain, and I feel like the thing that I might have gotten when I rented it was, I want to say it was some sort of flight sim game. I don't remember what it was now. I'm drawing a blank.
Could be Air Combat, Ace Combat.
Yeah, actually, probably not. I think it might have been Ace Combat.
That would be Ace Combat 2. If you remember it being Ace Combat, because the first one was called Air Combat. Okay,
yeah, then it must have been the second one, but I think that was probably it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Mine was Power Rangers Pinball.
A quality title.
I didn't know any better, man. I think that's I think that's why I didn't, and I'll try to be as brief as possible because I know we're starting to get up on time here, but it was a game that didn't instill much confidence in being a great PlayStation game or like speaking to the system, because I was right around the age like I still kind of like Power Rangers, so I'm playing this game, and what was it? It was a decent pinball game but loaded with FMV trash. So I was thinking, oh my god, it's another Sega CD, and the Sega CD had some great games, but for the most part, it was just FMV trash. So I was like, okay, this is what the future of consoles is. This is what CDs are going to give me. It's going to give me grainy, terrible quality video, and just intermittent gameplay in between. And this is bad. And of course, the other game was Crash Bandicoot. And if you love Crash Bandicoot, God bless you. But I hate it. It's not that good of a game. I'm sorry. In order to save the game, you have to find special bonus levels, and the entire point of the game is to destroy boxes. Have fun with that. It controls well, but in order to do what the game wants you to do, it's a little stupid. It's like saying, in order to beat Mario and get the true ending of Mario, you have to collect all the coins. So screw Crash Bandicoot.
Well, that sounds like a future episode to me.
It absolutely does.
All right. Well, I think that's probably going to wrap it up for us this time around. I think we had a pretty good discussion about the venerable PlayStation. And as I had mentioned before, if there's any sort of input that our lovely listeners out there would like to send our way, we'd love to hear about your experiences with the original PlayStation, whether or not you grew up with it, if it was something that you came to later, perhaps, however you happened to come by it, we'd love to hear about it.
Do we have an email?
We do, as a matter of fact.
Does it still work?
It does still work. Last time I checked, yes. But if I recall correctly, and maybe I'll have to fix this in post, but if you would like to get in touch with us via email, you can do so at contact@retrohangover.com. You can also reach out via our Facebook page, or you can go to the website directly and you can leave a comment on, well, really any of our posts, but if you'd like it to make sense, maybe you'd want to leave it on the post for this episode, and that, of course, is retrohangover.com. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter, as a matter of fact, which, if I recall correctly, again, it should just be @retrohangover. So I'm going to be going in and kind of reactivating those social accounts shortly. So if you're listening to this and you haven't already seen that, expect there to be some messages coming through the ether very soon.
Yes. And quickly, I just want to shout out to Nintendo Seconds LP Tiger, since he says I'm going to have a little segment that he's going to post up on his show. So be sure to check it out. He does like 5-minute Nintendo news if you're into that stuff. So he's a personal friend of ours. He's down in the area that we live. So make sure to help him out and support his channel and his show. Say channel like fucking YouTube or something.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Mash that bell button.
So you can get notified next year when we come out with another episode. Kidding. But we appreciate it. It's glad to be back. Hopefully we get some episodes out at a more regular interval. And for everyone who listens to the show, we appreciate it. And we look forward to talking to you next time.
All right. Until then.
Have a good night. Happy playing.